as very much a kind of a youth studies perspective and maybe an overview of what's happening, bringing together a lot of things that's in the presentations today. Youth studies is a thing we can say maybe was a field that developed from the 90s onwards, largely a research area I think that's very much summed up about doing research with young people and for young people rather than on them. And it's produced what I think is a pretty good literature on young people's lives, their subjectivities and things like that. And I think that's something important we need to continue to do. In particular, since the 90s and the work of Peter Kelly, this idea of the entrepreneurial subject, I think, has been an excellent kind of figure to think about the pressures on young people. So we have like all the moral panics on young people, that they're lazy, they don't try hard, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. What we, can't see that, hang on. Okay. And again, what youth studies kind of does is kind of create ways of thinking against those dominant stereotypes and to think about the actual lives of young people, the things they face, the power structures they have to trajectory through in their transition to adulthood. So this paper's about that, thinking about aspects of that today. It's certainly, I'll get onto this in a minute, it's not jettisoning those kind of previous ideas, but maybe kind of slightly adjusting them to think about them anew. And particularly, I think the entrepreneurial self was largely developed when we were talking about the world as a risk society, and through the 90s and early 2000s, where that kind of model of understanding kind of broader structures in sociology was quite dominant. And again, I think there's still many aspects of the risk society that work today. But today, I think, in the era of financialization, platformization, datafication, and all this kind of stuff, I think there's kind of a different kind of qualitative, subjective thing coming on in terms of young people's place in the world. And, much of the things we're talking about today, we're thinking about the economic, the financial, the labour markets. What's often missing from young people's subjectivity is the broader stuff going on in the world that they know about and are immersed in that affects the way they think and feel. Things like climate change, things like terrorism, and the normalisation of far-right genocides. In Newcastle and Sydney in the last week, we've had like what looks like replications of US attacks on people like with knives here, like in public and stuff like that. But this stuff's leaking into the Australian consciousness now. So, we've had this work that kind of thinks about young people need to think of themselves as a brand. They need to make the right choices. They need to kind of pursue, to promote themselves. And as Peter's work particularly, I think, was excellent in pointing out, is that it's got very little to do about young people's actual well-being or happiness. It's got to do with making them a good worker. And I think this is very much still the model of the way young people are thought about in, dominant politics and media today. So much of this still stands. And also in youth studies, the notion of the future as a kind of real thing that we're kind of moving towards, but also more of a conceptual, effective device has been a really interesting way of thinking about young people's lives. Youth is this concept of moving from a child to an adult. It's like this transitionary period. So the future is embedded in the way that we think about young people. And young people are often used in stuff I've published before as like a proxy for the future. If we have good young people and they're going to be all right, the future's going to be all right. Kind of, wind beneath my wings kind of stuff. Hope is another thing that's important to this, and Julia Cook's work and others has been important on that. There's also kind of more broader social theory for thinking about the future, around no future and about the slow cancelization of the future that I think is something we maybe need to bring in to youth studies as well. So to think about this and think about how the future itself is speculative, the notion of speculation has become an increasingly popular thing in social theory and conceptually to think about the way that we are in the world. Not just financially, so people speculate, they buy bonds and shares and all that kind of stuff. But the argument here is that kind of logic of the financialization of the world has started to leak into the way that people are in the world and how they're making decisions. So there's lots of really interesting literature on this, and probably don't have time to go over this in detail, but it's also to say here that it's not necessarily a new way of thinking. Stranger's kind of book that many people know, Casino Capitalism, back in the 80s, financial system that has increasingly escaped the calming influences of democratic control. Much more recently, Mark Andreevic's book on infoglut, I think, is a really great place to start to think about some of these social changes about information itself and how it kind of affects our lives. He talks about the rise of predictive capacities of technologies in particular, primes us to start thinking about ourselves as through the lens of speculation. Lisa Atkins' Time of Money is really important text here as well. She argues very stridently and I think very convincingly that speculation becomes not just about the finances, but also about how social organisation itself is happening. It's a mode of accumulation centred on finance and money, but as a specific mode of social organisation, a rationality that defines the telos of action. And for Lisa, it's about temporality. It changes our connection to time and therefore changes our relation to the future in some very interesting ways. I won't go into that in too much detail. Another more recent work that I'm really into at the moment is Fourcade and Healy's stuff on the ordinal society. And they talk about how much speculation depends on the sociality of it, how it's about rumour and conjecture, again, talking financially here, but also about the way we're embedded in the world, the kind of movement of crowds. And they talk about how once we may be an entrepreneurial self, we're increasingly encouraged to think about turning our whole lives into this kind of project of financial investment. They argue there's increasingly ways that we kind of sell aspects of our lives online to kind of be able to make money, for instance. Others talk about how speculation kind of puts us in the realm of kind of divinity and magic. Like, to speculate is to guess. And really, if our lives create more speculation in terms of needing to kind of move towards a future, we're kind of left in this kind of weird space between responsibility and irresponsibility of knowing and not knowing. So there's a whole special issue on this kind of aspects of stuff, but speculation there being akin to divination of magic, and others that I've already spoken about talk about that as well, particularly Fourcade and Healy. And as with all new concepts that kind of build up a literature over time, there becomes a literature about how to resist this stuff. And I think this is particularly important. Michelle Fair's book, Rated Agency, that was translated into English. I think that book was written about 20 years ago, but it's kind of become more popular since it's been translated into English. Talks about the need for activist counter-speculators. On the one hand, to make the techniques of corporate governments and public admin appreciated by financial markets seem increasingly unduly risky. Again, there's a kind of social license to operate thing going underneath the need to promote this kind of stuff. And a particular really good book that I'm still kind of delving in and out of is the book called Speculative Communities. The author of that, I'm going to not get the name right, Komporozos and then Azar, has all these kind of different concepts based on the notion of speculation and the way that it has aspects in our day-to-day lives, that our imaginations are speculative, that rather than being homo economicus today, we're better off being thought of homo speculans. There's speculative communities, technologies, speculative intimacies, particularly writing there about the rise of dating apps and things like that. And this leads to speculative politics and counter-speculation. To speculate means to connect. Future societies' bonds need to be repurposed to think through more kind of progressive ways of organising our lives. Okay, so that's the very broad background. What does all this mean for young people and the research we've been doing? So in our centre, we've been doing lots of research over the past 4, maybe even 5 years now on young people's kind of financial practices, their use of buy now, pay later products. We've done stuff on sports betting. We're doing stuff now on finfluencers. We did the project on the creative industries and young people using debt there. Probably left some stuff out. And so as this has been progressing, we've written some what I think are really good papers, and we've analysed stuff in various ways. And I've started to now think about some of that data kind of backwards through this kind of more speculative lens. One of the things I want to think about here with these broader notions of speculative subjectivity and the way that subjectivity is theorised quite often is it's like this kind of universal subjectivity that everyone experiences. And I think that's quite useful for thinking about how social change happens. But the work I want to maybe do here is to show how there's distinctions in how that subjectivity is happening. And if we're all speculators now, the privileged probably get to invest and see those things pay off. The less privileged need to gamble and feel like they're gambling about these things. So we've done the work about the moral economy of debt. It's definitely a moral economy. It's also a speculative one. It seems to me to take on a good debt is to feel like you're investing, but to take on a bad one is to gamble. And there's some interesting work around the world about how people know they're taking on bad debt, but like they kind of say in very broad terms, what the fuck else am I going to do? If you have no real means to take on good debt, how can you take on bad debt? All you can do is take on bad debt. So I've been looking at some of our work through this lens. And I think some of the speculation literature has some stuff to offer our work. So when it comes to buy now, pay later, we have a kind of lot of data about delaying it. And to me here, it like feels like buy now, pay later is kind of investment, and it feels like you're getting positives out of it first. But after a while, when you use it for a while, it feels again a bit more like a gamble. Yeah, I didn't know it was a thing. I had to pay the first payment straight away, some rewards, you know, don't have to pay my first payment up front. It's like delaying it. It's not an issue now, but it's going to be an issue in 2 weeks' time. There's a kind of, feels like there's a kind of risky subjectivity moving into there. When I was using it at the beginning, I felt secure. I know my finances, they're all in there, I can pay it off. But now it's come to the crux. It's actually making me really anxious about how I'm going to afford the things that I need to afford. It's pretty frightening, trying to wonder if I'm ever going to pay this off. We've done some work on gamification, got a new paper out in Journal of Cultural Economy on gamification and gimmicks and buy now, pay later stuff. And to me, like gamification feels like gambling a lot in it. And there's a lot of kind of literature, some of it a bit moral panicky, I reckon, but about how like games online are kind of priming young people to be gamblers and stuff like that. There's definitely aspects of that going on. And we all know that our apps are using kind of poker machine technology to try and keep us on there and all that kind of thing. So there's definitely crossovers in the technologies and knowledges and exploitations going on here. But like, again, if you read this data through a more kind of speculative lens, you know, they send me the limits, you know, the rise in limit, for instance, if you're having $1,000 limit and you do well, now you can spend $1,500. What a good reward. You can go into more debt. $2,000 available to spend in any store. It's like a challenge here, you know, come and invest your money with us. It doesn't always feel that like the money exists. I thought that was a safer way to engage with getting a loan because it doesn't even feel like you're technically having a loan, and you can see the kind of notion of speculation moving through there, I think. And as Ben kind of pointed out, and I've got a kind of quote there that was in that paper that's currently under review, we have some kind of evidence here that like what's, I think, previously seen as a kind of good investment, HEX, and some of our, throughout our research projects, HEX was seen as a good debt because it was like investing in yourself for the future. In the more recent ones, particularly kind of after COVID finished and, you know, all the fees were put up, we have some evidence here that I think students are starting to feel like it maybe not be an investment as much as it is a gamble to take on kind of huge HEX debts. And it's the same kind of thing with like being in that precarious situation. You feel like you're investing by doing all this free work now, but, you know, is it going to pay off in the future? So again, the kind of slide between maybe investment and gambling there. So to sum up, I think that kind of speculative subjectivities is really helpful for thinking about young people's place in the world today, but I don't think we can kind of just apply it across the board. I think there's a kind of parallel here with the notion of generations, right? Where in youth studies, there's been these debates that generations is useful for thinking about how young people in the world, people born now kind of experience the world differently than people born before or those after them. There's debates about how actually that's not that useful. Of course, young people are so different, the class and gender and stuff, all that kind of matters. I'm kind of setting that up here as the same thing in a way. But I think we need to think about distinctions within this kind of speculative subjectivity. Particularly as it's pretty obvious that I think in that transition period, young people find that a lot of the stuff that they're sold from an early age, that meritocracy exists, that gender and racial inequalities are getting better, that, you know, adults will be responsible, they kind of starting to see through that kind of stuff, and this affects the way that they then engage with the world. In our interviews, I just get the sense that they don't kind of talk like this, but it's more of a vibe to keep with the thing we were talking about earlier today. There's got this more ironic and cynical disposition coming through, I think, when we ask questions about this stuff, a kind of whatever, a kind of fuck it attitude. What else am I going to do? I've just got to take the risk and get on with doing this stuff. Whether it feels like investment or gambling is kind of the empirical question here. So what I'm proposing that like something we may want to look into in the future is that if we're going to accept that like subjectivity is more speculative today, as well as being maybe entrepreneurial, we might want to think of distinctions of these risk positions. And, you know, of course, not all speculation is going to be equal. So at the moment, I'm kind of toying around with this kind of notion that the more privileged continue to be entrepreneurial, can continue to kind of be what I would call entrepreneurial speculators. But those that don't have, you know, the capitals, the support, the family and all that kind of stuff are more likely to be feeling the world as kind of hopeful gamblers. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thanks.